Hi, in this video, we discuss the concept of missionary feminism as written by philosopher Serene Khader in her book Decolonizing Universalism, a Transnational Feminist Ethic. My name is Sawa Fatma, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Southern Illinois University at Woodsville. Have you ever heard politicians say, we need to save those women? You might think to yourself, how noble. But is it helpful? Serene Khader asks us to stop and think about what is being assumed. Khader argues that there is a particular way of thinking that she terms as missionary feminism, where some Western feminists assume that they already know what is best for women everywhere. Instead of listening to women in different societies about what they want or what problems they face, missionary feminism assumes that liberation means becoming more like the West. Transnational and intersectional feminists like Khader criticize this way of thinking because it often ignores so many things like people's history, colonialism, war, poverty, and perhaps most importantly, the voices of the women themselves. Khader identifies 7 common commitments of missionary feminism. Let's go through them one by one. The first commitment is assuming that the West is the only model of gender equality. Missionary feminism assumes that there's only one truly gender equal society and that it looks like the modern West. Instead of asking what gender justice might look like in different cultural settings, it assumes that Western lifestyles are automatically the answer. For example, missionary feminists might assume that Western nuclear family structure is inherently more feminist than multi-generational households or joint family systems or other familial structures. And in their attempt to help women in these different familial structures, they might try to get them out of their homes, away from their in-laws or their parents. Or they might think that only if Afghan women could dress like American women, that would be good evidence that they are free. A better feminist approach would ask different questions like, how do we make women's lives better in any familial structure? Or what do Afghan women themselves say will improve their lives? Notice how different those sets of questions are. One set, the missionary feminism set, begins with assumptions. The other set begins with listening. The second commitment of missionary feminism is that there is only one way to understand freedom, and that is in the language of gender justice. Khader calls this as having a single moral vernacular. Missionary feminism assumes that in order to be compatible with feminism, everyone should define freedom in one specific set of moral understanding of the self. For missionary feminists, this understanding of the self places value on individual self-sufficiency over other ways that different women might value themselves, such as having strong familial ties, or orienting one's life towards their religion, or strengthening their connection to their God or their customs. It's important to note that people around the world understand their sense of dignity and their sense of integrity differently. The third commitment of missionary feminism is that they seem to think that history and progress moves linearly towards becoming like the West. Khader calls this Enlightenment theological narrative. The assumption here is that Western society represents humanity's future while everyone else is simply behind. You've probably heard this sort of language before, like that country's so backward that their women wear burqas. It could be any point of difference, doesn't have to be burqas, any point of difference from European or North American traditions. Some people have even argued that Islam should go through some sort of enlightenment period, much like Christianity. This historically simplistic view assumes that other civilizations and societies were just stuck in one static spot in time while Europe went through enlightenment. It lacks actual context and content about different societies. And of course, it's just downright condescending. The fourth commitment of missionary feminism is, have you got a woman problem? Well, Western intervention is here to intervene. Missionary feminists often assume that Western governments, their militaries, or international organizations should step in and save women elsewhere. Khader argues that this overlooks something really important. Women in these countries have often been organizing for change long before outsiders arrived. Think about Afghanistan. Before and during the US invasions, politicians frequently argued that military intervention would liberate Afghan women. But Afghani women themselves had already been organizing around education and healthcare and legal reforms for years. Similarly, international aid often goes to American or European NGOs instead of local women's organizations. Transnational feminists argue that local activists are usually much better at understanding their communities best and should lead all reform efforts. The fifth commitment of missionary feminism is that the harms of intervention are ignored. The very intervention that the West did to supposedly make things better. Missionary feminism tends to focus on the supposed benefits of intervention while overlooking the cost. Wars and sanctions just don't remove governments alone, they also create poverty and displacement, instability, destroyed infrastructure, and reduced access to healthcare. The 2001 and 2002 invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, respectively, were in part justified by telling the world that we were helping Afghan or Iraqi women. Even in 2026, one of the justifications given for attacking Iran was it was going to help the protesters, in particular the women's movement against the Iranian regime, by bombing said country. But years of war also produced enormous hardship and insecurity for millions of women. The sixth commitment of missionary feminism is that they have the wrong priorities. Khader argues that missionary feminism often focuses on visible cultural practices instead of issues that women themselves consider most urgent. For example, my students are too young to remember this, but in October 2001, Congresswoman Karen Maloney wore a blue Afghan burqa while speaking on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, to show how sucky things were for women under the Taliban. Meanwhile, the actual issues that Afghan women raise, issues like maternal mortality and healthcare and education and poverty, and of course the effects of the war that US waged, received little to no attention. The same thing can happen in domestic politics. People celebrate symbolic victories like having a woman CEO, but spend much less time thinking about affordable childcare, paid maternity leave, or economic inequality between genders at a said organization. Finally, the seventh commitment of missionary feminism is blaming culture for everything. Khader calls this resort to the cultural. Missionary feminism often explains away women's oppression in other societies by simply blaming their culture or their religion. But that sort of explanation leaves out a lot. Takes forced marriages that may be occurring elsewhere. Instead of immediately concluding like they are like this because of their backward and uncivilized culture, we may want to ask questions like, what has happened such that women's financial and physical security is tied to the institution of marriage? How has war impacted families in said region? Has poverty increased? Have governments collapsed? And what is the role of international politics? In other words, look at the broader political, economic, and historical context. Look at ourselves. So, what's the big takeaway? Missionary feminism assumes that Western societies already know what liberation should look like for everyone. For Khader, we should be listening to women in different contexts, taking seriously their own priorities, and recognizing the history of colonialism, global inequality, war, and local activism. That does not mean that we give up on gender justice. Quite the opposite, in fact. Khader adopts Bell Hook's definition of feminism, that is, feminism is opposition to sexist oppression. There's no need to be overly specific what the indicators of advantage and disadvantage are in any given context. Instead, we should figure out what is going wrong in our societies rather than what the future should look like at the very end if everything was just right. That way, feminism does not depend on a single vision of a gender-just society endpoint. We should know that different societies value and advantage and disadvantage people differently. And once we recognize that, we can figure out a way to eliminate those disadvantages that restrict women from gaining access to certain goods such as food and freedom from violence. Wishing radical care for our communities and solidarity in our shared struggles.